have Martin Empson here to speak today. He's a member of the SWP in Manchester, author and editor of several publications, including System Change, Not Climate Change, which we've got over there, Marxism and Ecology, and of course the book that is the focus of today's meeting, Socialism or Extinction. So Martin's going to speak for around 30 minutes. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks everyone for coming. I was very pleased with the title, Socialism or Extinction, which I came up with on my own. I, however, was disappointed because yesterday on Twitter, some wag pointed out that it would have been better to call it Better Read Than Dead. But there we go. I wrote the book for a couple of reasons, the first of which is that we are living through an ecological crisis on an unimaginable scale. I don't know if people have seen The Guardian this morning, but there's an interview with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, which points out the way that the climate crisis is now intersecting with things like war and food shortages to create an enormous rift, an enormous difference between incomes for people in the global north and the global south. And this causes, in turn, massive problems and great difficulties. He wrote in the most recent edition of the IPCC's assessment reports, the one on mitigation and climate change, that delay is death. And I think it's a useful summary of the scale of the crisis and what we face. I'm sorry, I'm actually not very well, so you must bear with me a little bit this morning. In that report, the IPCC, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, laid out the scale of the ecological crisis and what it means for humanity. They made the absolutely unbelievable conclusion that there are 3.6 billion people on the planet who are classed as being highly vulnerable to climate change, living in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change. It's actually quite difficult to comprehend that half the world's population lives in a part of the world where they can expect within their own lifetimes to experience events that will probably lead to their displacement, their deaths, or certainly the great impoverishment. 1.4 billion people live in coastal areas that are expected to be flooded within the next 40 years by 2060. 1.4 billion people. Think what that means in terms of the refugee crisis. Think how the people fleeing the Syrian war, fleeing from North Africa, are treated by the European Union, by Britain as they try and reach a safe harbour, reach somewhere where them and their families can live and survive. And that's a frightening concept, and it is something that our movement has to think about, how we act and how we relate. I think it was absolutely brilliant that in the run-up to the COP26 conference last year, the one that took place in Glasgow, the movement orientated itself around the question of climate justice, arguing that you cannot separate the environmental disasters from what that means in terms of poverty, unemployment, hunger, racism, war, and indeed class. And so that's the first reason I wrote this book. Partly it's a rage of anger at a system that has had 26 and almost 27 conferences now on climate change and has failed to dent the disaster, failed to make any difference at all, despite the warnings of scientists, of activists, of concerned politicians for decades now. The second reason I wrote it, though, in a sense, is that the environmental movement that we've been part of for many, many years is one that is full of raging debate and discussion. It's full of argument about how you change the world. There's a very popular slogan which is on posters, system change, not climate change. It's one that's chanted a lot, that our posters are very popular. Yet I think there's a real discussion about what that means. And I think it's a discussion that revolutionary socialists have a lot to say about. And I think it's an urgent discussion because the movement we are trying to build, a movement that is involved and has involved literally millions of people around the world, has to find a way of breaking through the limitations imposed by capitalism and offering an alternative strategy to avoid absolute disaster and to build a sustainable world. In the environmental movement, indeed much wider than environmental, Black Lives Matter and all sorts of other environmental movements, there's a phrase, theory of change, that comes up. People ask you, what's your theory of change? And all sorts of academics and activists and organisations have their theory of change. And in a sense, socialism or extinction is a revolutionary socialist, a Marxist theory of change. It's a strategy that says this is how we can win. This is how we can use the organised power, the power of the organised working class to challenge and fight for the sort of reforms that we need, and indeed a revolutionary movement that can destroy the unsustainable world that we live in and build a socialist, sustainable world. And in the book I take up, and I won't have time today to go into many of the discussions, but in the book I take up some of the raging debates inside the movement. The question of violence and non-violence, the question of how you relate to the issues like refugees and racism and inequality, poverty, and so on. How you build a movement that reaches out to wider forces in society, and debates around things like mass movements versus smaller movements. But really I do think that the movement and these debates boil down to one thing. They boil down to the question of capitalism itself. They boil down to the question of a system that systematically destroys the natural world, systematically exploits the mass of the population, and then at the same time places barriers to change that could make the world a better place and a more sustainable world. However, how you respond to that, the politics, the ideologies that you have, make a real difference. A few years ago, Naomi Klein, the Canadian environmental left journalist and writer and activist, said that only mass movements can save us now. And in a sense, she's absolutely right. Only mass movements can save us now. But how those mass movements organise, what those mass movements argue for, makes a real difference and a concrete difference. It's not enough simply to say we want to put a lot of people on the streets. You have to have an aim, you have to have a strategy, you have to have something that you're fighting for and a vision. And I hope the book does outline some of that. So my book is a polemical intervention into debates that are taking place and I think are crucial and important debates. But also it's an argument about revolution itself. It's an argument that says revolution isn't something that happens occasionally or used to happen in the past. Revolution is an actuality for the 21st century, and revolutionary anti-capitalist politics matter. They matter on the streets of Sudan, where the masses of Sudan are engaged in the revolutionary process that saw yesterday them take part in mass demonstrations of hundreds of thousands. And looking at examples, and I do so in the book, of events in Sudan, the processes that took place in Egypt in 2011, and historically in Russia and the Paris Commune, which are the examples I use, I think is very, very important for a new generation of activists who haven't necessarily gone through an exploration of what revolution means and how it brings about change in society. Having said that, I think that I also want to emphasise that these are debates that must take place in a fraternal way. We as the SWP, and myself personally, I've been involved in the environmental movement for 25, 30 years. We don't impose these arguments from outside. They are debates that we want to have inside the movement, in Extinction Rebellion, inside the climate strikes, inside the trade unions and so on, that we are arguing and debating with a layer of people who are beginning to draw the conclusion that capitalism cannot save them. There is no way that we can make capitalism a better place that will offer justice to the people in the future. But there are a number of things that I think we should insist upon inside the movement, a number of ideological points, if you like, that are red lines. The first of which is that capitalism cannot solve the environmental crisis. Now, we're at an event called Marxism. Many of us are revolutionary socialists, and some people have been revolutionary socialists for a long time, and it might seem strange to say that. But actually saying that capitalism cannot solve the environmental crisis is a contested argument inside the environmental movement. It is an argument that is not necessarily accepted, even by people who will say system change, not climate change. And there's a rationality to it. We all know, for instance, that we could have the sort of renewable energy systems, the sort of public transport schemes, the sort of insulation, etc., that would allow us to have a low-carbon future in a sustainable way. So it seems possible that we could do it. And all of us would have been part of discussions where people would say, why don't they just do it? Why don't they stop burning the fossil fuels and use the renewable energy? Some of us may have said it ourselves. And so one thing my book tries to do is to answer why they don't just do it and how we can make them start to do it and so on. But I also think it's important to emphasise that because capitalism cannot solve it, that affects the strategy you have. If you have an understanding that explains why capitalism destroys the world as part of its existence, actually a strategy that tries to tinker with the system, tries to make it a little bit better, isn't enough. And so I want to just explore that a little bit today. because I think it is important that we take this away and understand this. Karl Marx argued that there were two great divisions in capitalist society, the first of which was class divisions, the antagonistic exploitative relationship between the minority of the bosses and the workers at the bottom, the workers who are forced to sell their labour, who go to work, and the bosses who extract more value from the workers than they pay them on a day-to-day profits. And this is the source of the bosses' profits, and the surplus value they get from workers. And that exploitation, that relationship is inherent to the system. It cannot be removed from the system. You cannot have an exploitative-less capitalism, if that phrase is real. At the same time, the capitalists themselves are competing with each other. And this is the other important point about understanding the dynamic of the system for environmental politics, because at the same time, the capitalists are competing to stay ahead of each other. They're trying to get as much surplus value out, and so they can maximise their profits so they can stay in business and not driven out by the competitors. And this means that capitalism does two very, very strange things. The first of which is it organises production, not for need, but for profit. The oil companies burn fossil fuels and not renewable energy because they get more profits from the fossil fuels than they can from renewable energy. It means that things that people need are not made when things that are more profitable are made. But more importantly, for an ecological relationship with society, it means that the capitalists are driven on an endless treadmill of accumulation. You may have heard the phrase in the movement, you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. You know, you cannot constantly expand the economy on a system that is based on limited resources, and that's absolutely correct. But that infinite growth arises out of the nature of the system itself, that accumulation for the sake of accumulation, profit for the sake of profit, production for the sake of production, which Marx and Engels argued was central to the capitalist dynamic, and is certainly because all production is predicated on the exploitation of workers and the degradation of natural world, the uses of natural resources and so on, means that endless accumulation is systematically destructive to the environment. And that's, I think, the first thing we have to insist on. The second thing we have to argue for is that capitalism will organise to stop reforms that make it less sustainable. Now, it happens because of the profit motive itself. It means that companies that make the profits from fossil fuels, like the oil companies, coal and gas and so on, will all systematically organise to resist attempts to green them. And there's a very, very good example of this from the IPCC report I mentioned at the start, the one that Antonio Guterres said in Delay is Death, because that report comes out of a scientific process of consensus where thousands of scientists look at the summaries of the science and they say these are the consensuses that we all agree on. It also comes out of a process of consensus with the governments of the world. And so before that report is published, all the governments of the world had their say with what could be in it and what couldn't. And the Australian government removed the sections that called for a reduction in the amount of coal plants being built and the reliance on carbon capture. And the Swiss government removed the bits that called for more finance for the global south to help them mitigate climate crisis. And the Brazilian and the Argentinian governments removed the bits that called for less meat being part of people's diets. And the Indian and the Czech and the Polish governments and the Slovakian governments removed the bits that said that nuclear power wasn't sensible. So at the same time as the world's big body is saying this is the scale of the crisis and this is the failure of the system, the capitalist states themselves, at the behest of the powerful influence of those corporations, are stopping them, including those demands within them. And so that says us another thing, that there's an overlap between the interests of the corporations, the interests of those bosses and profit mongers, and the capitalist state itself. And in the book, I take up the discussion of the capitalist state, the Marxist concept of the state, because I think this is understood inside the environmental movement, indeed on the wider left. Let's explore this for a moment, because it has profound implications for the sort of environmental movement we can build and the sort of environmental movement that we have to fight for. There are 200 top oil companies in the world that have a market capitalisation of over $500 million. That seems like an enormous amount of money. It's not actually that big. The biggest oil company in the world, Saudi Aramco, has a market capitalisation of just over $2 trillion. But I'm picking the top 200 companies with a market capital of $500 million each. those 200, let's say the average size of a board of directors in the world is about 10. So that means there are about 2,000 individuals who run the oil corporations of the world. It's a tiny number of people. In September of 2019, the last climate strike that took place before the COVID pandemic shut things down for many of us, there were 6 million people on the streets, according to The Guardian. Quite literally, as Bob Crow said, we could all spit and drown the bastards. You know, there are 2,000 oil individuals, directors or whatever, who run the system. And that is a metaphor for me for the way the minority of the ruling class protects itself using the capitalist state from the number of people who could drown them, who could overcome them, who could fight to bring about the reforms. And that, I think, is not understood inside the environmental movement enough, that there is this capitalist state that in the last instance resorts to violence to protect the interests of the capitalists against the majority in society. Of course, it does other things as well. It employs a civil service, it employs the law and the judiciary, and so on and so forth, that also makes it hard to resist change. Nonetheless, of course, the capitalist state does break through into the movement, doesn't it? Quite literally in many cases. You know, the police who smash up your picket line or hurl you away when you're trying to block a road or protest against fracking or whatever. But more insidious inside the system, I think we have to argue that the state is a force to defend the status quo and to protect the interests. And in a fossil fuel system, and a system dedicated and stuck with fossil fuels, that means that the state itself protects the interests of the fossil fuel corporations. That makes it incredibly difficult. Now, many people on the left and many in the environmental movement argue that the state is neutral. I think it isn't. In the last instance, it's the resource that the capitalists use to protect their interests, and it cannot be rescued or taken over. And the problem with this is that those that argue the state is neutral actually have a strategy that says we can take it over. And that means let's elect a few people to Parliament, let's get some Greens, some lefties in government, and we can seize hold of the state. And so what I show in the book is how historically that's not been possible. I use the example, which I don't have time to go into, of the left reforming government in the early 1970s in Chile under Salvador Allende, which attempted to impose quite minor reforms and inspired mass movements from below, which was brutally repressed by the capitalist interests, the Chilean ruling class coming back and massacring and murdering tens of thousands of people to stop that. And also we have to argue that elections don't change anything. Electing left politicians, even a left government, leaves a layer of the capitalist state, it leaves the entire capitalist state in place, and it leaves the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, and the bosses untouched, the Rupert Murdochs, Elon Musks, and Jeff Bezoses of the world. And so we must argue in counter to that the state must be smashed. It's a conclusion that Marx and Engels came to. It's not my conclusion. I'm not that genius. Marx and Engels came to this conclusion looking at the Paris Commune of 1871 when the Parisian workers took over the city and ran it for a few months. Lenin and Trotsky and others argued through 1917 in Russia about how they could smash the state. And they understood that there was a force in society to do this, the working class. And if you recall from what I started off, the power of the working class arises not from their numerical superiority, not from the fact there's lots and lots and millions of workers, but because of their central role to capitalist production. And that's another thing that we have to insist upon inside the movement. The working class is crucial to the environmental movement and to all others, not because there's lots of us. We don't play that numbers game like Extinction Rebellion sometimes do. Its leadership often argue that we just need to get more and more people on the streets. We argue for the involvement of workers because they have a strategic power in society, because of their centrality to capitalist production. And that's why we emphasise their involvement in the movement. And we want workers to be involved, and we want them to be part of that movement because they have that power. Now, that's not to say that the environmental movement is over here and the working class is over there. Most people who've been on an Extinction Rebellion protest, most climate strikers are part of the working class. If they don't work, they will work when they graduate, or they will work for most of their for their lives. But the working class is much bigger than the environmental movement, and we want to expand out to it to make workers take up environmental process, but also to make environmentalists take up workers' process. Which is why it was so inspiring to see Extinction Rebellion, climate strikers campaigning against climate change taking part in the RMT picket lines a week or so back. But there are other reasons that we want workers' involvement. Firstly, workers transform themselves through struggle. We know this. I was on an RMT picket line in Manchester Piccadilly 2 weeks ago, and one of the women who was a revenue guard told me that she felt 10 foot high. I never felt so tall, she said. And that, in a sense, in microcosm, is how workers transform themselves through a process of struggle, and that is a much larger process during a revolution itself. But the other reason is that through their struggles, and this takes place on an enormous scale in revolutionary moments, workers begin to create the organisational structures that can form the basis for a new way of organising society. And this, I think, is the final piece of the jigsaw, and the thing I think that the revolutionary left have to offer the environmental movement as a vision of change, but also a vision of where we want to get to. Because in the book, I talk about a number of revolutionary processes in Russia, the Paris Commune, the Egyptian Revolution and the Sudanese Revolution. And I choose those for a number of reasons, partly because they're inspiring, partly because many people have not read those stories in the movement, but actually because they're all examples where working people engaged in struggle have attempted to create their organisations and society which they can run in their collective interests, and I would argue in the interests of the future of the world. We know that the Parisian workers took over the Parisian state and ran it in their interest for a few short months before counter-revolution defeated them. We know in Russia workers created institutions called workers' councils and Soviets, which didn't just organise their struggles, their revolution, also started to organise how society could be run, the distribution of food, the education of children, and all sorts of other aspects of production. And I think this is important because we see it time and time again. So we know this isn't just something that occasionally happens. We know in the Sudanese Revolution, the resistance committees, are organisations of ordinary people that are starting to direct the revolution, shape the revolution, call for people to be out on the streets, call for strikes and so on, but also can become the embryo of ways of ordinary people controlling their communities, controlling the economy. Because that's the final place, really. It's actually our vision of a society is not one where it's just capitalism is greener. I wish capitalism was going to be big green, but the argument I've placed is that capitalism will not green itself, and actually fighting for capitalism to be green is something what we must do, but it is also something that we recognise in the long term isn't a viable alternative because of the nature of the capitalist system. And that means that we have to think about how we can organise a society where ordinary men and women, ordinary workers, own and control the means of production, the infrastructure of society, the public transport systems, the land, the farms, the agricultural systems, but also the factories, the manufacturers, the offices, the call centres, own them, control them, run them, organise them in their own collective interest, not for profit, but for the long-term needs of the population and the world that we want to live in. And that concept, I think, of a planned economy, a democratically planned economy, where ordinary people from below shape and plan their society, I think is a radically a revolutionary one that we have to argue for inside the movement, because it's the alternative in it. When people say to you, we have to fight for a more sustainable world, and then they get disappointed when they hear that 19 states in the United States have crushed Biden's poor attempts to limit fossil fuel emissions, and they say, how can we actually do it? We have that vision to argue for about it, and I explore in the book how a democratically planned economy might work, how ordinary people, through their participation in production, through their input, can exchange information, ideas and resources horizontally and vertically inside an economy that is based on participation and democracy at every level, and how new technologies that we have developed in the last 20 years make that even more possible than it was at previous revolutionary movements. Now, I don't think that's necessarily to say that what we do as activists, as revolutionary socialists, is that we go along to the environmental movements and say there's no point doing any of this because capitalism is so bad it will just stop you, and what you've got to do is wait for the workers' revolution. Of course not. In fact, what we do as socialists is we actively organise to spread environmental arguments inside the working class movement, inside our trade unions, inside our communities, inside the wider movements like Black Lives Matter, racism, anti-racist movements, and so on. And we try to bring the energy of those movements back into the environmental movement to spread and grow the political concepts and to argue for visions and argue for a strategy to win reforms, because reforms will matter. It will matter, for instance, if the $100 billion that the UN has been promising to the Global South for mitigation of climate change since 2009 is actually finally paid at some point in the future. It will matter, for instance, if we manage to shut down a fracking plant or prevent them reopening the Cambo oil field or all those other things. It will matter if we win schemes to insulate our homes and have renewable energies, but we have to recognise the limitations of the system that we're fighting for those within. And that means that we have to simultaneously argue for those reforms, but also point out that the process of winning those reforms is one that can give confidence to the workers to fight for much, much more. And I think this is the essence, if you like, of revolutionary practice, that what we do is we fight to involve workers in a wider movement at the same time as fighting for that movement to expand its horizons, to take up revolutionary demands, and to move much further. And there are going to be many, many opportunities for this. I think that while we can apparently live in a world where so much seems bleak, where literally billions of people face starvation, forced displacement, war, want, poverty, and so on, we also understand that we can win. I think the RMT strikes a few weeks ago gave us a glimpse of our power, a tiny, tiny little glimpse. I think the events in Sudan give us a sense that actually the military states around the world, the oil corporations and so on, aren't infallible, aren't undefeatable, and can be stopped. But it won't be easy, and that I think is the thing that we have to be clear on as we push towards further struggles. In 1914, when Rosa Luxemburg wrote a book called The Junius Pamphlet, one of the most wonderful anti-war polemics, anti-imperialist polemics ever written. And in it, she argued that the choice facing humanity was socialism or barbarism. And she was absolutely right. It was this choice between revolution or the ongoing slaughter in the trenches, the diseases, poverty, unemployment that would rack and destroy the working class. And as a young socialist, I was very, very inspired when I first came from the environmental movement to socialist meetings and heard people talk about this choice, because it gave me hope. In a bleak world, it gives you hope. But I actually think the choice is inadequate now. I think we are living in a barbaric society. I think for those 3.6 billion people in the world, that is barbarism in reality, in actuality. And so we have to insist, I think, on the actuality of revolution in the 21st century, the actuality, the possibility, the realness of revolution as a force, indeed the only force that can save us, save people, and build a sustainable world. The choice today is socialism or extinction, and that's why I wrote this book. And I hope that it is part of a debate and a discussion inside the movement that can help strengthen our side, strengthen the trade union movement, strengthen the environmental movement and the anti-racist movement into a force that can bring about fundamental change that will get rid of this rotten, unsustainable world and build a socialist future for everyone on the planet.
Thank you very much, Marty, for that excellent speech there to start us off.
Hi, my name is Alder. I'm a supporter of a small left-wing group, Cultural Tendency. I think this is, I haven't had a chance to read the book in great detail, I only got it yesterday. But I think it's an important book. I encourage people to read it. From my point of view, I think it's an important development in political perspective of the Socialist Workers' Party, because I was at Marxism in 2019 and I thought that the perspective being put forward was for that kind of radical Green New Dealism as a necessary step to get a mass of people involved, and then you would be able to push forward within that, I can't remember the phrase, I think it's probably in system change, climate change, about this radical mass movement, and then within that fight for the need for socialism. But I think this represents something important, and that the reality of socialism or barbarism or socialism or extinction is very much a reality, because it's not that we're looking at ecological collapse as something that's going to occur, it's something that's occurring now. And I think that Martin is quite right to point to the, one of the first impacts of that is going to be mass migration, and how capitalism will respond to that. And so internationalism in our response is going to be very important. But I think something else which is very important is trying to engage in the environmental movement, Extinction Rebellion and other groups that will arise with a open and explicit political struggle against Green New Dealism, even its most radical ones, as Martin does against Andreas Malm, who would be one of the more radical Green New Dealists. And I think there are two aspects to that strategy. One, I think that Martin's absolutely correct, both in the struggle for reforms and in also posing the potential for socialist transformation, which will be necessary, is to build new forms of social governance based around participatory mass movements along the generalised lines of what Lenin outlined in the State and Revolution, workers' councils and the various forms that will take. Those are necessary both in the struggle now and lay the basis for a new way of governing society. Yep. But alongside that, I think needs to be an explicit struggle around popularising the idea that it's necessary to take the processes of production, distribution and exchange out of private hands. The problem we face is not just those 2,000 executives who run the fossil fuel industry, but the whole capitalist system. Simon Parani's book, I can't remember what it's called now, he very clearly outlines that we're living in the age of fossil fuel capitalism. It's everywhere. Think of plastics. Where do plastics come from? Plastics everywhere. Fossil fuel capitalism is integrated into it. Finance capital is integrated into fossil fuels. It's not something that's separate, and that's a very important thing to struggle against, because that's a common idea that we can block, that is possibility of blocking with the good green capitalists. So I think that open political struggle is necessary if we're going to manage to survive the effects of ecological collapse, which are already baked in and are happening now and we're happening, let alone hopefully being able to create a sustainable future after we get through the chaos which is coming.
Thank you. The comrade in the orange. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation. Looking at the struggle or the fight for socialism, my point of view would be the power at hand and the resources that we can gather as people and fight back. Because politics, if you look at it, from ancient ages, has already been a game of elites. So in elitism, whereby it's a block is built, fund is pulled together. If you look at it, politics is a game of elites. So who control the means of production and stuff. So then if we are uniting as people, what will be our means of backup? So in the sense that can lead us to dismantle this block of the power that is in place. But in my belief, I think capitalism is here to stay, but it's how do we work as people, not like standing to reverse the block, but working along the capitalism, or not a central or a lefty, totally ideology of method of politics, to say that we pull the leadership in complete lefty side, that we will be able to win capitalism. But my understanding would be how do we work with capitalism in the sense that introducing good policy, better taxation of corporations, so that we can bring down funds of being able to sustain, if there can be a movement, because if just say we're going to unite as people, fight the regime in place or the system in place, that has funds, that's not, because when there is money, there is power. So, like if you look at going back into as a Labour Party, somewhere, somehow, I'm going to be honest, there was some kind of challenge where we tried to push forward the belief of socialism, which will be a total government ownership of all means of production, but then how do we get the money? Because if we don't work with capitalists alongside them, that can be a bit a hard shield to crack down. But then I would like from you as an expert to tell us, if we stand as people, how do we raise the means of possible funds that we can be able to move this movement forward? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Comrades over here in the blue t-shirt. Yeah, you. Thank you.
Helge from Norway. I totally agree with your perspective, but some experiences from Norway, because we have tried, of course, to focus on the working class and bend the environmental movement towards working class. So from 2013 we set up this initiative where the main NGOs from the environmental movements, the church and the trade unions was part of an alliance where we also had some very concrete demand. As you know, Norway is a very oil-regulated economy, so one of the demands was also, of course, to reduce investment in the oil sector and scale it down. Of course, that's a big challenge because half of the unions in Norway is totally dependent of the oil industry. So we managed to get I would say half of the main unions in Norway as part of that alliance. But that was, of course, the unions which was the less related to the oil economy. And of course, also we had full support from the top leaders of those unions too, which was also good. And they sometimes even took up our demand that was very clear inside the labor movement on these issues. But the very problem was that we didn't have enough force on the ground in the trade unions. It doesn't say that we didn't have that, because we had, 2013 on, we had conferences with from 1,000 to 1,500 people joined them every year since 2013, with people with this alliance for working class and the church, etc. But the whole thing collapsed very early in the pandemics when the oil company went on offensive and asked for a tax relief plan, which was extremely central for them, which made it possible for them to, during the pandemic, to invest in large, unprofitable projects in the Arctic. The strategy, of course, was to move even further to the Arctic, and it was enormous, large projects, 15 billion Norwegian kroner. It's been 10 billion pounds investment project in the Arctic, which they made, and the whole the leadership of those unions didn't really oppose that. Those who even was part of the alliance, because they felt that they, during that crisis, couldn't really criticize the part of the unions who created the value. So the lesson from that, just to conclude on that, is that yes, we can do these things. It's extremely important. We create activists, we create consciousness, etc. But you have to build in these unions where you have the oil people are totally dependent on oil industry. And there you have to build from the ground and take the argument to every worker, because it's possible. We have an example of that possible, but that's really hard work. The point is that we have actually to confront capital, structure, investment, and that's not focus on only individual, reducing consumption, etc. And that's one thing I think is central of socialists to say, that we always focus on the companies, the structures, the investment, because that's the side of the future, and that's where we can really change things. Okay, thank you.
Two comrades right at the back with their hands up. Thank you for your patience. Right, the second to back row, and then the row before. In the middle. Yes.
That's actually a very frightening example that the comrade just spoke about, that the very conditions that are leading to the destruction of the planet and the very rapid melting, as the comrade will know, in the Arctic Circle, much more rapid than the average for the world, actually leads to the conditions where the capitalists think, oh good, we can get at more of the same, thus accelerating the cycle because they can penetrate more easily into the ice fields. But I just wanted to talk about very quickly a recent incarnation, I suppose, or a version of the argument about capitalism being able to reform itself away from environmental breakdown. And that is the argument that in order to break away from reliance on Russian oil and gas, could capitalist states, basically, could the governments of the world, as often put in softer terms, move very rapidly to sources of energy such as wind-based electricity. And in the UK, that's quite a strong argument because it's already 28% of electricity by wind or something, so it is quite possible to envisage a massive expansion, and that this would lead to less reliance on the evil Putin and his malevolent gases and oils. But in actual fact, and one commentator on Twitter, it just came across, gave a whole list of examples of European governments that are in fact moving to expand wind generation around their coasts and onshore as well. And that's all good stuff, we wouldn't oppose that. But is it realistic? Is it something that they're going to do on such a scale that will move away from the excessive consumption of fossil fuels? In fact, if you look at what they actually do, as well as these little plans that were being brought forward for expansion of wind, Boris Johnson's first stop after the invasion of the invasion of Ukraine at the end of February, his first port of call was Saudi Arabia. He didn't go and visit, I don't know, Vestas or whoever make wind turbines. He went to the most powerful oil-producing state, one of the most powerful, and urged them to turn the taps up. I think eventually they agreed to turn the taps up a bit in order to curry favour with what we might broadly call the Western powers. So, in other words, capitalism won't shoot itself in the foot. It won't knife itself in the back in order to move towards wind-generated electricity, for example. It will, in fact, entrench itself in the existing system of a reproduction of more and more oil and gas exploration. The Guardian's recent expose of the carbon bombs, in other words, the plans that are already in train to explore more and more gas and oil and fossil fuel exploration. The glimpse of the way out is, in fact, not just the RMT strikes a couple of weeks ago, and that's a fairly easy one, isn't it? Public transport. But also the oil worker strike as well in the North Sea, who are the people who are going to help us to expand wind power, for example.
And I'm really sorry, we've got so many hands up. Can everyone just stick to 2 minutes now, please? I'm sorry, I won't get around everyone.
I just want to address what was said earlier about Green New Dealism, because I thought it was an interesting contribution. We've met some fantastic people, some of whom are here with us today, locally in Coventry through, Green New Deal type organisations, and I'll give Green New Deal Rising as a example. There are all sorts of young, new activists involved in the Green New Deal movement. I think that we really need to reach those activists, and there are really crucial reasons why we need to do that. And those reasons are to do with the nature of the way we want to deal with climate change and the way that those movements want to deal with climate change. And those come back to reformism or revolution and who funds these movements and who funds us. So we're funded by our membership, trade union contributions, things like that, just for clarity and openness. Whereas Green New Deal Rising is billionaire funded, Extinction Rebellion is funded by major capitalist backers, as some of you may know. And this is important because while those movements have great things to say and involve fantastic people, they're still very different in how they want to deal with the climate crisis compared to what we want. They're still about tinkering with the system, which, we've all tried tinkering with the system. All of the COP26, the IPCC have all tried to push the ruling class into making, even the tiniest changes that will hopefully, that people hope will arrest climate change. But the recent IPCC report said that, with the way that we're consuming fossil fuels at the moment, we're actually on course for a rise of 3.2 degrees, which is horrific. I mean, that will render large parts of the planet uninhabitable, and as Martin has said, that will affect billions of lives. For us, as Marxists, that's the difference. that what we want is massive systemic change, that is not enough to tinker with the system. While we appreciate that, as Martin has said, reforms and trying to seek them builds confidence, it's not going to stop that 3.2 degrees rising, the billions of deaths, displacement, and that's the difference between us and the Green New Deal movement. That it's not enough for us to just tinker with things. We fully, really seriously recognise the effect this is going to have on people, and we recognise the urgency of change, of revolutionary change. So while we should, I think, participate in the Green New Deal movements, it should be without dropping our demands and our politics, and it should be with the aim of telling people, look, these are billionaire funded, they don't want systemic change, they want to try and tinker with the system and retain it. Whereas we want this radical change that will save lives, and thank you very much.
Comrade at the front here in the grey top and the lister. An announcement.
Thanks very much. So what I wanted to share with people here, it relates very much to some of the things that are in Martin's book, because it is a message from activists in Egypt who are living under dictatorship, some of the people who have been involved in the revolution, which Martin talks about in quite a lot of detail in his book, and who will be living under dictatorship and facing repression at the time that COP27 takes place in Egypt later this year. Essentially, this is a kind of preview for people in this meeting of a statement that's going to be launched online in the next few days. And it calls for activists in the climate movement not to engage in the kind of greenwashing operation that this murderous military regime is going to engage in around COP27. It's a very clear linkage of the fight for democracy, the fight for social justice, and the struggle for climate justice. So I'm going to be handing these out at the end. And I would really encourage comrades, please don't tweet about this yet, because it's going to go out online and it will make more of an impact if we all do it together. But please look out for announcements on social media from Egypt Solidarity in the next few days. Thanks very much.
Two rows back.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, everyone, it's only 2 minutes now. Sorry about that.
2 minutes. I want to make 2 points if I can. The first is, I think the point Martin made about the centrality of revolution to changing people's views of themselves and the world around them is absolutely crucial around the question of climate change. Because we're not going to get the sort of mass transformation that's required, affecting billions of people, imposed by governments from above. Indeed, quite often it enables the right to pose as the friends of ordinary people. You think about how at the moment sections of the Tory party and Nigel Farage and people are saying that the threat to your cost of living comes from green measures. That net zero will take away your money, it will increase your fuel bills. This is a very real question, and it can't be dealt with simply by saying we have a better parliamentary programme. It can only be dealt with by something that genuinely enables ordinary people to think that their lives will be changed for the better. That environmental action will make their lives better rather than worse. This is a very basic question. This leads on to that if we're going to get a complete reordering of society, it won't come about by just putting a cross in a ballot box. It can only be done by people from below, and this I think is very important. The second thing is, when we talk about the involvement of the workers' movement and the trade unions, I think we have to be absolutely clear that this is going beyond simply the presently existing structures of the trade union movement. It's about workers in struggle, militant workers fighting and changing the world around them, not just getting right-wing leaders of trade union movements to sign up to some pledge. It is actually about the strength of the trade union movement fighting from below, and this is what's necessary to give a vision of a real transformation of society.
Sorry, I feel like I'm taking this. Look, thanks.
Martin, thanks for your talk and thanks for your book, because I think it's a massively timely intervention. Because what is clear is that capitalism cannot solve climate change. Because there's a simple solution, isn't there? Stop burning fossil fuels, transition to renewables, increase energy efficiency. But that hasn't happened. And in part, this is because fossil fuels are completely locked into the system of capitalism. They're not an overlay. The whole development of industrial capitalism in Britain from the 1800s was based on coal and then oil. And what that means is this massive historical investment on the part of those at the top in the fossil fuel infrastructure, which they would have to write off if we were going to transition to renewables. And that's why they fight to stop it. That's why the biggest delegation at COP26 was not the people most impacted from the Global South, it was 500 representatives from the gas and oil companies who came to lobby and actually got their way. And then you see all the minimal pledges at COP being ripped up now with the excuse of the horrific war in Ukraine, actually, because they're saying they have to increase. You know, Biden, he had all his green credentials. He's now pushing for more oil and gas exploration, more production in America, because they've got to be energy security, as they put it. They've got to get energy secure in that way. So ripping up any of those pledges, and by the way, war is embedded into capitalism as well. These are consequences of the competition at the heart of the system, driving forward to buy more carbon and then have to burn it and drive out domination around the world. The thing is that even here, some of the gains we've made are being rolled back, opening up the question of fracking that's had a moratorium since 2019. The Cambo oil field may be explored, more licences for gas and oil exploration in the North Sea. But the point here is then, how do we fight? Because that's a big debate in the climate movement. And I think what we're arguing for is sometimes people say we need more militant action, so that's just small groups. We need more militant action on a mass scale, involving millions of people in 2019 and last year. And that means we'll have to take these actions to actually stop them rolling back the gains we've made. But you know, that's how it links to revolution as well. Because sometimes people say, be realistic. Let's be realistic. Capitalism is not going to solve it. It hasn't for decades. We have to use that mass action as a basis to think we can transform the world totally and make revolution not an abstract, it's a reality that we are seeing in the big struggles beginning to play out across the globe.
I just wanted to say something about organised workers and how we fight for climate justice. My name's Sarah, I'm an activist and member of the National Executive Committee of my union, PCS. We are the civil servants and all the government departments we organise in. And we know that about the racism that climate refugees face, and we know that extreme weather events are driving more people to move across the world. And in my union, and I have to say, I can't take any credit for this whatsoever, our colleagues in the Home Office are refusing to cooperate with our racist government. I'm enormously proud of this. So the people, our colleagues who work on the boats, the cutters in the channel, have refused to take part in pushbacks of migrants. They were supposed to push migrants back into French waters, so they rescued them instead. And they're also refusing to cooperate with the Rwanda plan to deport people. They are saying we don't come to work to drown people, we don't come to work to deport people, our job is to help people through the asylum system. And this is essentially a cell they've created in the Home Office with hashtag Our Home Office. It's about the values of our union, it's about our values as human beings and solidarity with people who need help across the world. And fighting the racism, the reality of racism and what's happening. But ultimately, if we're going to challenge our government, we have to build mass strikes. We're balloting in September for strikes. We have to win the threshold, we have to beat the anti-trade union laws, we have to build a mass strike, and ultimately challenge this filthy system and overthrow it and get something better. Thank you.
Lots of people being patient. Thank you for talking. I just wanted to build on what Amy said. Apologies. Just wanted to build on what Amy just said about the fact that there's trillions of pounds built into the infrastructure of fossil fuels. If the capitalists rip that off, they would suffer, and they're going to use their state to block it, which is why, like a Franklin Delano Roosevelt Green New Deal isn't going to work because the capitalists won't do that. But it's even worse than that. When I went on holiday, I bought loads of engineering books on renewable energy, and renewable energy is now cheaper. We can, you know, there shouldn't be an argument about can renewable energy work. It can, at the moment, completely replace fossil fuels. Even more, the cost of renewable energy, they believe by the end of this decade will be between 2 and 4 cents or pence for every kilowatt hour produced, which is much cheaper than fossil fuels. And that sounds rational, but under capitalism, as Martin said, companies don't run companies to sell things at really cheap level. They, you know, if I'm a fat cat business person at Marxism, I don't know why I'd be a fat cat trans woman at Marxism, but I wouldn't want to switch from selling gas or oil at £3 or £4 per kilowatt to selling renewable energy at 2 or 4p per kilowatt, considering I'd have to write everything off. So they're gonna block at every turn, and that means that there will be revolutions where people are forced to act or die, and have already happened in Sudan and Egypt, and will continue to happen, where we have to explain to people that capitalism is not going to solve this because of what Amy said, and because they make more money out of fossil fuels. And as there are less fossil fuels in the world, the market price of fossil fuels goes up, so they make even more money. We have to overthrow the fossil fuel companies, we have to seize them through the kind of actions that Sarah said, and the kind of actions that Amy said. We need like a mass movement to just seize oil companies and energy companies. And I think the trade union movement should be calling demos at the energy companies right now, because people are seeing, my flat, it's £189 a month for energy for a one-bedroom flat. We should just, we should protest at the energy companies and start taking them over.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'm Gio from Dorset, and I'm here with Annie. Lots of excellent things have been said here today. I'd just like to particularly ask Martin, please. We are members of Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil. We have blocked oil refineries, we have sat on the M25, so that's what we contribute to the campaign for the crisis. There was an article in SWP recently about grannies for the future. We're the grannies for the future that disrupted a touring large council meeting, and we just found out that they're not going to charge us and charge us. As ordinary people, we do our best to mobilise, and I would just like to ask you, I'd love to hear what you think of Insulate Britain, Just Stop Oil, and I think we've heard about it since the rebellion. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts coming from an SWP perspective. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Right over here. Yeah. If you could be really quite brief. Thank you.
I appreciate the book. I think it's so significant at this moment in time. I live in a small town called Ashley Makerfield, and a development company wanted to wreck a massive woodland, get rid of the green belt, what is the council estate. It's a £91 million development. Some people in the campaign come to us, SWP, we're struggling. And what we did, we involved the local trade union movement, we got the NEU involved, we actually linked it to climate change campaign. This idea of NIMBYism is absolutely rubbish. We went to the estates, people did care about climate change. We did the only demonstration Ashley Makerfield's ever had, where the RMT turned up, and actually in the end we won. We stopped a £91 million development, which is incredible. And I think 1.5 years of this, with the estates, people do care. And I went to a meeting on Wednesday with some fantastic climate activists who were saying, actually, people don't care, and actually, we've got to get people to care. And that isn't the case. people do care, sometimes feel like they can't change anything, but linking it to trade unions, the NEU students sent out letters to all the schools, and the kids in the schools talked about climate change and our campaign in the schools around the area. It's a fantastic victory, and I'm hoping that sort of links in and we can view what Martin's saying locally with the trade unions, and some of them people that campaign went to the picket line as well, and been to LNT picket lines. I've never ever thought I'd have the confidence to take this Egyptian thing back to our campaign, and not only will I'm going to take this when it happens as well. I think we'll be interested in it. But that's why it moves on, when you can actually link the two, I think. So that's hopefully a good example, maybe the past example of what you say, Martin, if that makes sense. Thank you.
I'm really sorry to everyone who's got their hands up. We will take our final contribution from this at the front here in blue. Do you just want this, Martin? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Name's John Molyneux from Ireland. I'm also coordinator of the Global Eco-Socialist Network. And the first thing I want to say is I think I strongly support, I think we should all support the declaration from Cairo. This is really important in the movement. It's important for solidarity with the Egyptian people that they're suffering, but it's also important in terms of debates of where change is going to come from. The other thing I just want to, it's a question for Martin summing up, which is what specific or concrete demands do you think the movement should be fighting for at the moment going forward? Right, I agree completely with the anti-capitalist argument, the argument of revolution, but what particular things do you think we should fight for that might point beyond capitalism would help mobilise people? Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful discussion there. Thank you, Martin. You've got a few minutes to summarise.
Yeah.
Excellent discussion.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks to comrades. It's always good to hear people's ideas and so on. I want to start, though, with the book itself, because Socialism or Extinction didn't come about because I protested outside COP26 and thought, do you know what, they're not going to do it, we need a revolution. And I want to defend a little bit the SWP and our tradition, I think, of saying revolution is the solution to climate change. Because at Marxism 2019, I was there actually, in fact I spoke in this room at a book launch of a book called System Change, Not Climate Change, alongside Sarah Ensor and Ian Angus. And it was an explicit argument about revolution. Several other comrades contributed to that book. At that talk, and at that event, Ian Angus spoke about the Metabolic Rift, which is an explicit development and use of classical Marxism to explain how capitalism destroys the environment, but also takes human beings and breaks them and separates them off from the natural world upon which they labour, and distorts our labour in the interests of capital and the interests of profit. And that's the tradition we fought for and argued for. That's not to say we don't fight for reforms. You see, I'm not necessarily saying I'm against the Green New Deal in the sense of what it demands. I'm against the Green New Deal because I think it is a strategic mistake and an error in an approach. I'd love to win it, and I'd love to see the working class movements in America, Global South, in Europe, that can fight and demand and fight and win this stuff. That would be a brilliant victory for the working class. My argument is that in the context of the capitalist system, the fossil fuel economy that comrades have talked about, and the state, those demands are almost impossible. That's not to say we don't fight for them. John asks what demands we should have. I think we can fight. In Manchester, if you're a Ukrainian refugee, you get free public transport. I think every refugee, every working class person should have free public transport. I don't think it's impossible to deliver because they have it in Europe. And I think there are those sort of demands, and I think those demands, it's impossible to come up with the demands because so many people have so many different experiences around the world, and there are local things. But I think we can argue for things. We should argue for no return to fracking, no reopening of the Cambo oil field, none of that expansion of fossil fuel production that comrades talked about with what Boris Johnson is wanting and doing. And you see, I think one of the strategic questions for revolutionaries is how do you relate to the movement? And reforms matter. Reforms, if you're a worker in the oil industry, in the fracking industry, you need to know that those green people aren't going to take away your job and leave you on the scrap heap of history. So what the environmental movement says to workers in the oil industry matters, and that's why things like the Climate Jobs Report, where we say, actually, you can transition. You can have better paid jobs, safer jobs, nicer jobs, less environmentally destructive jobs in these sort of industries matter. And I think that we've articulated that. But actually what we do as revolutionaries is we don't just fight for the reforms. We fight to have the most militant reforms, the best, most radical reforms. And we fight for reforms that empower the working class to fight themselves further. You see, if workers win a reform, they're more likely to fight for more things. If workers win in their workplace a green rep or recycling bins, they're more likely to say, actually, we want better jobs, we want more jobs, we want better conditions. You know what I mean? It's a process, and that's how we approach the struggle for reforms in the context of wider revolutions. And I think we have to fight for those reforms, develop the combativity of the working class to fight for a complete transformation of society. And a comrade asked quite rightly, you know, and well done to anyone who stood on Insulate Britain. Well done to anyone who's taken the abuse from the Daily Mail, the hypocritical bastards who've done nothing for public transport and then blame us for blocking roads and people can't get to work. Well done. But I tell you, it's not going to be enough. And we have to articulate in the environmental movement a type of movement that can actually say, how do we really change the world? And I hope people block roads for a long, long time. But actually, I want to see it done by 10,000 people, not by 100. I want to see more disruption, because our movement has to be disruptive if we're going to change the world. I want to see fossil fuel plants blockaded. I want to see them unable to bring the fracking machinery in, etc., etc. But it has to be done by tens, hundreds of thousands of people as part of a grand strategy to lift the working class to fight for much, much more radical demands. And it's not impossible, you know. Our movement put them on the back foot. Amy talked about how they're using the Ukraine war to roll back some of that stuff. Our movement did that, though. We forced them. We forced them in the run-up to COP26, in the climate strikes of 2019. We forced them on the back foot. We stopped them. We made the moratorium on fracking. That wouldn't be there if people around the world hadn't lain down in the road and blocked things. It would, you know, we forced them to make all sorts of demands. We forced all sorts of institutions to declare climate emergencies. The next step is to make them fight for much, much more and force them much further, and to resist any attempt to roll things back. Anne quite rightly talked about Egypt, and I should perhaps have mentioned it. I think it's worth thinking about COP27. It's not going to be possible to go and demonstrate in COP27. We will have to think about how our movement can show solidarity in the streets on the Western Europe with people who incredibly bravely are standing up to appalling regimes. I think it's a condemnation, both of the United Nations and actually the COP process itself that they go to Sharm el-Sheikh. Not just that they've gone to the place run by an appalling dictator, a counter-revolutionary dictator, but to a place that's steeped in wealth, that is barricaded off from any chance of protest. They'll allow a few people to take to the streets and, you know, look like an opposition. The greenwashing in the Sisi regime by this is an absolute disgrace, and it's a shame, and it's shame on those politicians who have done that. But we should use the opportunity to protest and build the movement further, and to raise demands, and also to raise solidarity with the people in Egypt and the movements around the world that are doing it. But we also have to use it as an opportunity to be incredibly condemnation of a process that has failed time and time and again. And I tell you, COP27's in Egypt. Do you know where COP28 is going to be? The United Arab Emirates, the seventh largest oil-producing country in the world. If that doesn't tell you that capitalism is both unable and in many ways unwilling to change, then nothing will. And that makes the argument for revolution so much bigger, so much more powerful. Because actually you can say these bastards aren't going to do it, they haven't done it, and we have to do it ourselves. But I tell you, there's one final piece in the jigsaw. You see, in this book, I talk about struggles that are inspiring, struggles that have won things, struggles that demonstrate how we should organise, and revolutions. But I tell you, there's one revolution in there that won, and that was the Russian Revolution. Why did it win? Because there was a Bolshevik party that linked the demands of the working class and the peasantry to a struggle against capitalism. And if we do not build that movement now, if we do not build that organisation today, our struggles won't win. We need a bigger revolutionary movement in this country. We need a bigger revolutionary movement in the world. And that's why I'm proud to say that Socialist Worker stands in the tradition of saying system change, not climate change, revolution to save the planet. And you should be part of that. You should be in the revolutionary movement to save the world, to save the future, and to make a difference now. Join the SWP after this meeting and buy the book.